Hi, my name is Benedict. Welcome to week 3. If you haven't gone through weeks 1 and 2, I would strongly encourage you to do that. Also to watch the intro. Cherry picking here probably is going to do you more problems than good. If you want to get a sense of what we've learned so far in practical terms, I was driving home the other day and this song came on the radio, and I'm thinking, I haven't heard this for a long time, but I'm actually hearing very clearly all the things that we've been discussing so far. The song is actually, it's not the coolest song ever, but there's something very cool about it. The band was called Exile, and the song was I Want to Kiss You All Over. Have a listen to that, because it comes in bits and pieces, and you can actually hear the chords and how they sit in the piece and how they form the foundation of everything that then proceeds to happen in that piece. It's a little bit disco, it's a little bit sort of laid back rock, but it's a very charming song. And most importantly in this case, you can actually hear everything that we've been covering in the first couple of weeks up to this point. Obviously, moving forward this week, we're starting to look into melody. Now, melody is a huge subject. It's larger than all of the others, and it's kind of infinite. So it's impossible for me to cover everything, and in my own way of being an iconoclast, I will try and break down everything that most people think is what you have to do, because I hate that kind of finger-waving, small r rules that it's not useful. Your job is to get out there and get results. The more you understand over time, the more you can learn about things that we've learned about theory and harmony and how to make it work. But just getting going is more a case of, how can I get there? And that's my aim here. But of course, before we get into the program, I've got to remember, please support me. Each of these programs takes at least 10 hours to put together. That could easily be double, because I've got to do all the prep, all the setup, plus, of course, all the learning and the understanding that's happened over the decades here. I paid $60 an hour to a theory teacher to help me get as far as I did get, and in no way am I ever saying that I'm the expert on this. I'm deliberately being the non-expert to help you where you're at, or to give you a completely different point of view if you are tired of the expert approach, which gets a little challenging. What we're looking at today is to take those chords, that chord progression that we looked at last week, and say, how can we now turn this into an actual piece of music? Again, this is very genre non-specific. I'm doing everything I can to try and keep genre out of this as much as possible, because this is the foundation that applies to everything. So here's a set I prepared earlier. I don't remember if they're the same chords or not from last time, but we have a C, A, D, C progression. That's it, straight triad, all in root position. So C, A, D, C, all in root position. I made a minor change to the second run round. And it changes the feel, but it's still really the same. So that's an inversion. What the name is for pulling the bottom note and whacking it on the top is, I don't know, and I really don't care, but broadly speaking, I've inverted one of the notes in the chord to put it in a different position. Simply taking it here, shunting it up an octave, and notice how it changes the relationship here, and particularly here. So it feels different, despite the fact that it's exactly the same. But we have changed what is quite a leap here. So that is my basic chord progression. I then said, let's do what we did last week and take that and smooth these chords. I think from memory these are all first inversions, so I simply took the top note on every single one and moved it down. That wasn't a wholesale, that's what I'm going to do. It's just how it worked out because I wanted to make these notes seem like they were more smooth. As in, if we look at this one, you see that the chords are all a bit... There are leaps. There's a fair leap here, which obviously is smoothed out when we're looking here. So it just sounds smoother. And if we bring in, hear how they mesh perfectly with each other, despite the fact that the notes are in a different position. Because recall, if we go back to lesson 1, the octave, we've only got these 7 notes, and then they just repeat in each of those octaves. So if this here is moved to here, it still essentially sounds the same. Essentially. Close enough, and then when we put the two over the top of each other, it's not like the average punter is going to be putting down their beer and their iPhone and going, they sound the same. That's part of what we're looking at here, that there are lots of ways to voice a chord, and you can voice it however you want, and nor do you even have to keep it the simple version of it, because as you can see here, we've moved some things. I've got this little incidental note, which just helps move things along. We'll talk about rhythm more later. I've tried to keep rhythm mostly out of this for the moment. So this is the framework for our piece. I cannot stress that enough. Every piece has to have a framework. It's like a building. You can't build a building without a framework. You can't have a car without a frame. You can't have an aeroplane without a chord progression. So really important, have a sense of what these things are. It is entirely possible to build music with no concept whatsoever of chords, but I can tell you from first-hand experiences it's far harder. Once you hit the inevitable issues where you have to do I do this or do I do that, how do I solve that problem, you will tend to find yourself snookered. That's the point at which you're likely to go, oh, this is too hard, and give up, or make a decision that's probably not serving the piece. Whereas if you've got an understanding of your framework, your chord progression, then you could pull that back up and go, you know what, that's going to flow easier. Problem solving, that's all it's there for. So that you've got something to nail things to. The listener understands what the structure is. When you're driving your car, you're not thinking about the framework inside your car. But it's there. And your doors are glued to the frame. The wheels are glued to something that's glued to the frame. Otherwise, guess what? You'd have a pile of bolts on the highway. And that's not a car. So really important to always remember that this is why this stuff is important. And the more you understand that about your piece, you can make up and choose any rules that you want for each piece, then the easier it gets to solve the problems that you will encounter. Encountering problems is not a sign of poor construction. It's inevitable. Every piece has its things that you've got to say, what do I do with that? You could see here where I was, okay, I've got that big leap. So I solved it here. So you see, I didn't actually really need to move all of them. All I really needed to move was one. So in terms of effort, this is the more elegant change than this one, where I moved everything. But both are equally valid in terms of which you prefer, which works better for your piece is the right one. So there is no right one. Now, what we need to do is to extrapolate this and start to turn it into a piece. This is the fundamentals of what's called orchestration. Orchestration does not require orchestras. Obviously, if we were going to take this and have a full orchestra play it and make it sound like proper orchestral music, yes, there's a lot of work. But all we need to do is simply say, okay, how do I take this and turn it into something? So remember what we did last time? We get nice and lazy and we drag our things, our chords here. We'll get rid of the top notes, and we're left with this. Okay, brilliant. We've now got a bass line. Let's shunt that down an octave. We don't want to shunt it down too many octaves because while it sounds, it's probably going to cause you problems. That sounds nice, and the whole thing that we're looking for here is merely reinforcement. The most important purpose of a bass line is not to be and make girls want to do it on the dance floor. It's to actually hold down the structure of the piece. And when you do that well, then you get the results that you're looking for. Now that can be very simple. This is the simplest we could do. Hear how that really holds down our construction. If we drag this fella in, mute our bass line, a bit light and airy, and now we've got that bass line in, it feels solid. Cool, that's what our bass line is primarily meant to do. Again, we will look at rhythm in a different program because this stuff is actually more important than rhythm. I know a lot of people in rock and pop and what have you think that it's all about the rhythm, and I'm not going to say it's not, because when you get a track with great rhythm, then it obviously does well. But you can also look at lots and lots of songs in the rock kind of groovy arena, and you can say, oh, that's got a cool rhythm, but you know what, nobody's ever heard of them. I've been being served on YouTube a lot of mid to late 80s bands, most of whom all seem to be named after Judas Priest songs. And yeah, while they're okay, they're a pile of cliches and they all have been misses because none of us have ever heard of them. They didn't have that special something that is the difference between huh and ba 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 ba, which is jump. Or Living on a Prayer from Bon Jovi or whatever, similar sort of thing. They've got something amazing, and it's the melody that is more important than the rhythm. But we'll come back to that in a moment. So this one here, as you see, what we did was take our root notes of our chords. These are all in first position or in root position. So C is our bottom note, and C is our bottom note here. A is our bottom note here. A is our bottom note here. That's the easy and incredibly safe way of extracting your bass line. If, however, you have done something interesting with your chords, like here, if we copy these over and we take, actually let's just copy these, let's just move these down. Nope, why do they not want to go down? There we go. And we'll delete those. Hear how that's different? That sounds kind of odd. If we pull in our chords here, that's okay. It was an A, but we're now playing C because that's what's here. But remember, we moved this. So if we were still back on A, it sounds more reassuring. However, there is really nothing to stop you from saying, whatever the lowest note is, I'm going to make the bass sound. Root notes. Hear how we've got now a different harmony. We've got a different feel. It's not as basic, salt of the earth, rooted, because it's not the root note. It's actually the fifth. So our bass is that sound there. But it's playing actually a fourth below. So that's a different way of doing it. Once we look at what I have done, we will see that I did something similar to this. And if we look at our root notes, they are different. But it still harmonizes. But if we look in comparison, very centered and settled. Interesting. So the thing that you can take from this is if you want the most obvious and centered and settled bass line, stay with your root note. If you want it to be doing something and expressing something other than centered and settled, use other notes. It is easier and safer if you use something that's in the basic chord. But in theory, there is nothing to stop you from using any note that you want. Just understand that the results probably could become problematic. That doesn't mean that you can't solve those problems, but you could well be running into a situation where you start to get disharmony. And if you want disharmony, brilliant, play it, make the most of it. Remember shower scene from Psycho? Disharmony. If not, then you're going to have a relatively serious problem that you're going to struggle to know what to do with. So don't get too cute or too clever, which will become an issue, especially when you get into the Bootsy Collins kinds of bass lines, that you're probably going to start to create problems that while you think that super funky dude is harmonically probably going to undo what you're doing. Part of the reason why someone like Bootsy Collins, and if you're not familiar with him, go track him down on YouTube and watch him. It's just amazing that he can be but his sense of musical intelligence and how the harmony is going to go together is so great that he can be playing stuff all over the place, but it sounds so perfect and centered and right. That's because the guy has stunning feel for things. So different ways to approach bass, but look at primarily reinforcing the root note. And you should know your root notes because of your chords. Righto, the next thing, and this is where we need to really get interesting, is that we might need a little bit of movement. Here's one I created earlier. We will bring the electric piano in. Whatever we do, we probably want some movement. We'll get into rhythm later, but this is a bit more complex, and I don't expect you to fully get it, just showing it to you. Is it the best bass line ever? No, none of this is ever the point. So what have we done? We've got our root note, and then we've got some movement. But if we look at these notes, this is obviously a chord tone. That's our fifth. And an E. That's our E there, which is currently sitting on the top of the chord pile, but it's actually our third. So our bass line is actually playing 1, 5, 3. It's chord notes. We give ourselves movement while still reinforcing that chord. The strength is in the root, and the movement, the fill part, is on the back end of the bar, where we've already established our primary rhythmic and structure. Like we're saying, here is where the frame is, so that the listener knows where the frame is and feels confident, yep, I'm in this. and then we start to move. And in this case, every single one of these is a 1-3-5 variant. It might be played in a different form, but it's a variant. And you see here that in one instance, I've got the note re-triggering in here, and the next instance it doesn't. We'll go over that more in rhythm, but all we've done here is just created movement out of what's already there. Hang on, that changes. We've used the same thing, and we're going to talk about this a lot more in the next lesson, but we've got variety in it. So here, oh, it slides. And then this, it's in a completely different octave. I know a lot of people don't trust playing their bass lines in a different octave, but these amazing bass players, Bootsy, Mick Kahn, or any of these kinds of guys, they will play across several octaves. Saying I can only play the lowest notes ever, that's a bit dangerous. Give yourself the ability to move, because then it's a nice surprise. So now we've got a lot of movement there that we didn't have before. Again, we will cover that more in another lesson in a couple of weeks' time when we do get to rhythm. Right, where have we got now? So if we got all our layers together, that's starting to sound pretty rich, isn't it? Compared to which doesn't sound like a lot. That's sounding really rich, like there's a lot going on. Put a vocal on top of that, we're done. Maybe some drums, but we're going to focus on drums a lot later. I know this is about melody, but I see bass lines as being melody. They are part of the melody, but they express a lot simpler and primarily around the root note. Let me show you something. If we take this, let's just mute our melody for the moment, turn these into 1 to make it easier, move them up 1 octave, let's move them up 2 octaves. So they're now in lead territory, they're above the chords. See what I mean? That's technically a melody. Is it the world's best melody? No, but it's a melody. It's using chord notes and it's moving around. And it's added a layer of rhythm, movement. So saying that our bass lines and our melodies are not related and that they're near that Shania should ever meet, big mistake. So I'm seeing that our bass is a subset of our melody and they're all revolving around our chords. Brilliant. So now let's start to look at how do we get melody. We will say that for the moment we're going to work around our improved chord set and pull this into our melody sound. So this is our root notes. Technically, that is a melody. It moves. It's playing the root note an octave above. But remember, that's kind of monophonic construction. It's a bit medieval. But there's good reasons and times to do that. If we want to keep some sort of melodic movement up top, but without being complex, because we've got something else more complex that's happening, maybe a real lead or a singer, who is actually a real melodic lead, or they bloody well ought to be, then this will be doing the job. It's showing the movement just fine. So we can take the root note. We can also take the top note. Now you'd be like, huh? Remember, our chord is C, therefore E and G, C. That's this note here. So if I take the top, the fifth position of each of these, root, see how it's essentially the same, but it's brighter, it's a bit more uplifting because we're using a harmony, which is the fifth. They're the building blocks or the beginnings of melody. Let's look at this a little bit closer and start to do it more by hand. The great thing with having a DAW that allows you to do this is that you can see. And this is part of why I rail so hard against loops or any kind of preset thing that says, here, we're doing this for you, because you have no control. So we've got our chords. They look like this. They're going to stay in the background. And if we take our root position and draw it out, okay, that's what we had before, but it's not entirely inspiring because it lacks movement. There's not only no rhythm, but there's no flow. So let's look at how do we smooth this off. Let's start very simply. Let's look at what this feels like it might want to feel comfortable. Well, that's just a bit dead. So let's back that up a little bit and say, well, here is where I'm currently at, and there is my target. This is a pretty important part of learning to write melodic things that are going to work harmonically, is to say, where am I going? A lot of people don't think that. They don't think, where am I going? But without a target, where am I going? Am I going to the shop to buy fish and chips? Am I going to the mechanic to ask him for a banana? I've got to have a purpose. So let's say we just put this note in here. Oh, okay, that's not a chord note, but we don't want to use only chord notes. Chord notes being the ones that are in the chord at that point. To say I can only use those notes is a little, as your father. So what am I looking at here? That's a B, but guess what? 1, 3, 5, 7. So if this was a seventh chord, we would actually have a note sitting on this B. That's much nicer. It's starting to flow, isn't it? Now, I know this wants to move fairly quickly here, so let's try this. Starts too quickly. No, not. The timing is still wrong, because we've got to remember that we've got a meter. So that's our 2, 3. So 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2. So we've got to keep our... Okay, great. Right, what do we do next? We've used a little thing. I'll refer to it as a figure. I'm not sure that that is correct. That's literally a very workable melody. Whether you like it, whether you think it fits with your genre, please ignore. Just understand how melody is constructed. Now this is fine because it's going back to root, but it's not fine at the same time because it just doesn't seem right. Let's say we move this guy. Nothing has to stay where it was. Okay, that's interesting, because we've put this onto a position where it's not exactly one of the chord tones, but it's interesting. All right, now this is better. The only bit that I don't like is this rhythm. Rhythmically, it feels like it needs to be one side or the other. We've stayed on the 3, but I think it needs to be off the 3. That's better. The other one that would be obvious to try was to move this way. And that's perfectly valid too. It's going to depend what comes next. Remember, we've always got to have a target. So what has our melody done? Ultimately, it's moved from here to here. So C to our melody has... That's it. If we knew what our target was, that could be our melody. But we've got a bit of space to fill, and that's not going to fill that space enough. Plus, if our melody only went in one direction, especially if we kept repeating, that can become incredibly dull and pointless. If you want to know what that sounds like, listen to Trap, except they would probably go... because the whole melody would somehow insult them. I've probably insulted them, but I don't rightly care. We're looking at how do you do it right. You can then break whatever rules you choose, provided you get the right results. If you're having genuine hits with it, I guess you're doing it right. If you are not, and no one's picking up your stuff, then you gotta look at why. Now this is going to depend on what comes next. We need to extend into the second half. Let's glue these two together. And we've got the same basic chords. So we've got to decide, well, where do I start? For the moment, I'm just going to say, okay, let's go there. And then it's... you got to remember where the roots are in this, and once you've rearranged a set of chords like this, it can get a little harder to remember where the roots are. If we have our bass line on board, which I don't there, because it's the modified one, then it gets a little easier, but we're not going to let that get in the way because, you know me, I never like to let anything get in the way. Let's just say, well, we know that A is the next root. Then it's D and C. All I'm looking at doing here is looking at, well, what are my targets likely to be? Let's go roughly the same format. And I might just split that note there, see what we got. All right, it melodically works. Let's see what happens when we put the two of them together. I feel like this is perhaps a little too fast. So this is how melody writing gets done. You're like, I'll try this, I'll try that. And if you're not prepared to put the time in to try that and see what happens, you're not going to get there. You can do it by playing. No. Okay. But if you're not a player, and I'm not, but sometimes I will be playing around going, oh, okay, and then I've got to work out how that rhythm works with what I've got, but there's nothing wrong with doing it the way you're seeing here. Now, because I've moved that, this needs to be more the way I initially did it. Not like that. And you've got to look at the big picture. How does this balance? Oh, I think that's actually going to throw it back onto the half, which is all right. Now, these were short notes before, so let's look at doing that, and then this repetition that we had up here on the top note. Okay, now I feel like this balances quite nicely. It's got a cool little bit of a lonesome cowboy thing going on. And we might consider splitting that note there. And I'm still not 100% about this. In which case we might consider splitting and simply allowing the note to restate. Or what if we get sneaky and actually change our rhythm? Now we could get quite clever here and actually carry this across. And let's move that maybe to here. I think this is interesting. What I'm showing you here is that things don't have to stay rigidly in place. We might think, oh, well, there's a break in section here because our chord progression starts again, so I have to finish here. And I'm going to say, no, you don't. And I quite like that. I would probably build from this now, if this were one of my own pieces of music. There's something here that I feel like I want to emphasize that. So an easy way might be to put in a funny note. And these require probably more effort than I'm going to give you here. That might do. Let's move him to a chord note. I think it's kind of cool at naught. If this were velocity sensitive, then I'd be reducing the velocity. But it's not, and it doesn't matter. And there might even be the chords to do the same thing. Here, let's pull his velocity down, even though it's not going to make any difference. there is a fully formed melody. Interestingly, it starts here and it finishes here. So it's a melody that's ultimately not travelled to a different place, or if it has, it's come home, and this is the important bit. We could have come home an octave below or an octave above, but then we've got this, and that's okay, but we've got to make sense of it. In a sense, it wanders around a little bit. It goes down into a little bit of a valley, it goes up the hill, comes back down into the valley, and then climbs back up the top of the hill and goes home. Cool. That's a fully fledged journey. That's Lord of the Rings right there, isn't it? That's the mountain. That's Hell's Deep or whatever. Up another mountain because they're obsessed with climbing mountains. Doom. And then going home. Brilliant. We're all good and we can have 11s. Second breakfast. And see how we're using these chords to reinforce this, because we've stopped on a G, which is our fifth, bearing in mind that we're in C, and this chord here is C, even though it's expressed upside down, and the same chord is here, which is C, and so we're using that to reinforce, so we're actually showing this, a power chord. That gives us that rhythmic feel that the piece seems to be looking for. How you get there with your own pieces and your own genre things, we'll look at a little bit later, but it is not for me to say, and nor is it for anybody else to say. People who come in and go, but that's the only way you can do it. Like I remember somebody once, I showed a piece of music which borrowed some elements of psytrance. And so I presented as like, this bit of a take with some psy, and somebody straight away put the boot in, harpooning me with like, but you're in the wrong key. It's like, what? Can you only write psy in one key? Apparently, yes. So my answer to that is, fuck you. Because obviously you're not interested in music, you're only interested in something that's in one key, therefore the bass line has to be at exactly X number of hertz. And it's like, where's the fun in that? So do what you need to do to get your song done. And that's reinforcing that half an ending and creating some surprise because we've gone across this borderline that we know exists. Oh. So the melody then picks up in a different spot. Do it, don't do it, whatever. I'm happy with how this has worked out. You don't have to like my music, just to understand that you can do this stuff. So now if I drag back in my bass line from these chords, I like it. That's all you need to know how to do to be able to make melodies. So remember, we've got our root set of chords, which are these things, and then we've extrapolated these notes, the low ones, or the root notes in this case, because actually we'll go back to the other ones. We'll drag these guys out, and we'll put back in our strings. Now, this was not planned. The melody was not pre-planned. And we put in our bass. Come on, mouse. Go back to our chords. So root notes with our 3 and 5 just for accent, and then moving around. We've started with our root note and we move around. So let's play this with the strings. These are in root position. that works. Let's pop this back in. Cool, it works. Now what we might consider doing is pop this guy out, take this, just going to go with the world's simplest bass line again, and we know that that repeats. Actually, no, before I do that I will drop this an octave so that it is in the bass register. Now let's go again with the simplest bass line we could have done, just root. See how it still works? Now I'm going to add a whole other instrument. Again, this was not planned, but let's give it a go. Let's have another instrument. Thor. Grab a Thor just because. And it's relatively easy. We're going to pick another timbre, so I'm going to go with a phase modulation sound. Why not that? Probably should send to reverb, otherwise it'll always sound like it doesn't belong. Sounds brilliant. Let's give it a bit. I'm just guessing, but for now that will do. Let's take our bass line. I'm going to copy it here. Let's join them all up so we can move everything in one go. Now we know that's playing in the bass register at the moment, which is probably not the right thing. So let's take him and move him up an octave. Now do you realize what we've got? This is called a countermelody. It's melodic, but it's sub-melodic. As in, we've got this lead sound, which is like fully melodic dude. We could play this on its own, on our cowboy harmonica, and people feel like they're hearing the whole piece, because it's representative of the whole piece. Everything else in the piece is actually there backing this, even though it got written last. There is nothing to stop you from writing a melody first, going do, 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 there's my melody, and then working out the chords underneath it. It's just a little harder. But a countermelody is counterpoint to the existing melody, so it needs to be harmonically useful. There are points at this which this possibly isn't, but nonetheless it is technically correct. So let's bring this guy in. Actually, let's just mute everybody. The sounds are a little similar to each other, which is not entirely helping the situation. This is what happens when you make stuff up on the spot. But this is how I compose. So we've got this melody that's moving. Now we've got something that's melodic that's moving around it. It's providing a counterpoint to it. Hear how they hit together and then they move and they hit together again. that sits nicely in the mix. Countermelody. If we get rid of it, see how the piece goes flatter? There's apparently a bit of an obsession or a bit of a new thing where people are calling a secondary melody. Like if I play my Lonely Cowboy harmonica thing and then I play something else after it, possibly with a different instrument, they're calling that countermelody. That's not countermelody. It's just a different lead at a different point in the piece. It may be the less than the main melody hook, but it doesn't make it a countermelody. Countermelody means it is counterpoint to. So if my main lead is here, here my counterpoint that's a countermelody in that it's working around using counterpoint or harmony to actually make it work. This isn't the world's best countermelody, but it works in the situation, and it proves that where I was saying if you treat bass as a form of melody, then you're actually never going to be too far wrong, because that was our funky bass line, simply moved into a different octave and given a different sound, and the role it plays is a little like an electric guitar, just playing ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk kind of chords in a riff. Countermelody takes a little bit more time to get there, but do start to consider it, because once you add in countermelody, your piece becomes richer. Again, just so got our whole piece going, drop it out, piece becomes simplistic and a bit flatter. It's richer. We don't necessarily know that it's there until we drop it out. So a countermelody can be quite obvious, or it can be this little thing that's sitting inside just sparking harmony and creating movement. So out of our chords, we've created melody, countermelody, and our bass line. If we dragged this guy out and put the funky bass line in, which is the same as our countermelody, we've got more obvious movement in the bass, but our countermelody is now less effective. If we were to drag this out and put this in its place, remember we would need to move that up an octave. Again, not a great countermelody because it's lacking movement. All it's doing is expressing the chords again, but it's sort of doing the job. If we chose to expand on this a little bit, perhaps by saying, let's have it move from there to there to there to, and I'm just guessing here, here, let's move it the other way. So, again, I'm guessing here. Let's move our timing just so that it feels more consistent. Didn't feel quite right. Now that might be nicer if we didn't have the two moving at the same time, because they sort of stumble. And in this case, I think we might use a repetition there. And that repetition may want to be sooner. And I sure think that wants to come up. And let's try this. Let's try that. Okay, we've now got a more traditional counter melody. Let's put it back in the piece, make sure it all works together. See how we're going to change the mix, because obviously that needs to have more of a role. This is how melody and counter melody get done. Now we've hit the hour, so that's really the end of the lesson. We'll run through homework. Homework at this point needs to be to create a set of chords, smooth them off if you feel that that is necessary to make those chords form a nice skeleton for whatever it is that this is going to be about. Then use that to extract a melody, to create a melody. I would rather see you creating melodies before bass lines. If you're going to bass lines going, I need to funkify the most funkful bass line that's ever funked, then you're going to lead yourself astray and it will create difficulties. You will slow yourself down. Create a melody that plays off of that. So your job is to start with this and do this. Give yourself, say, 4 bars, 1, 2, 3, 4. You don't want to be too long, and just create something that works and will loop at this point. If it doesn't loop, then you know there's something wrong. It's okay. That's good enough. If you can create something like that, now I do not want you cloning what I just did. While there's some value in that, you can't say that you've actually created a melody. You just stole mine. So create your own set of chords and your own melodies. Keep doing it over and over until you start to be able to go, I can do that. Now remember, one of the keys here is to know where you're starting from and where your target is. How do I get from here to there? And see, the first thing that I did was that I had a sense of, well, okay, that's my first note, that's my second note, because they're with my 2 root notes. So I created some passing notes to move from here to there. As soon as I had done that, then it started to suggest all the other things that I was going to do, because my third target was up here. I typed there, 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 and so that created the movement in between, and that's turned into a melody, and I'm really pleased with the two halves of it. So that's your homework. Set up some chords or use ones you've already got, don't care, smooth them, just make it so that it flows nicely, and then create a melody line that sits on top of it and works. It needs to be harmonic. So while you can say, oh, well, I'm going to do disharmony and what have you, yeah, disharmony is a whole other thing to do, but make sure that it works. Preferably not by only being safe and using chord notes, because that's kind of lazy. You've got to work out how to make that movement and have the harmony still feel good. If you're comfortable with that, by all means look at introducing a countermelody, but countermelodies take more time. I just want you to know that they exist and that they are a target for you. Now, for those who would like to spend a little bit more time, we're going to look inside something, and I'm going to introduce you to the most important thing in all of this. Melodies have to have purpose. You might have noticed straight away I start to attach some sense of story to this. I've listened to the piece that I was creating and gone, it's got a kind of a mournful cowboy thing to it, in which case I work with that, as in I follow the story where the story is going. Here is one of mine. I suggest you go over and listen to Exile's Kiss You All Over to understand how somebody else was doing it. Here I can show you inside one of mine because I can't play other people's pieces of music. Here's one I prepared earlier, Into the Fae Prince, from a relatively recent album. Let's look inside the construction of this piece of music, regardless of whether you dig the form or not. I've introduced chords here. They move very slowly because this is my form. I've got a lot of sound effects moving around it. And I've got movement coming in with those bass sounds. We'll skip forward. Because time's a big factor in my pieces, slow movement. This chord progression is obviously a little bit more like a melody, only they're expressed in chords. Our bass line is reinforcing that, because without that it sounds a little drifty. And we're building up, having something sort of fairly solid within such a wispy structure. Now looking at melodies, we've got two melodies here, and each of these carries a thematic idea. And they are two sounds playing two different melodies that ultimately come together, otherwise it's a bit pointless. And each is a thematic of a particular character in this environment. So we've created, obviously with the name, Into the Fae Prince. So he's a fairy prince. And I've used the word fae because fae suggests to us... I've used the word prince because he's a bit, which you will hear as he comes in, which is this moogie lead. Grand. He's also got this digital pad which is playing part of the same material. If we get rid of all the clutter, we've got this. It's pretty simple. He's just come in and he's making his statement, which is like, here I am special. And that's expressed through this movement. digital pad is paralleling, but also creating some counterpoint. You'll see here, these chords which were complete have now been pulled back. They're simpler, but they have been moved up here as well. So we're just moving our instruments around to keep it interesting. If we keep this too full, it's just going to glug up. So we've got some of the sound and feel of the bandy. That's staying in the mix, but we're using more of this sound and its contrast with our brash Prince. Here, look at me. You'll have to follow me. I know what I'm doing. I'm going to tell you what to do. That's his theme. Watch Star Wars. John Williams was master of theme. Dum 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 dum. Jaws became the theme. It's the theme song of all sharks now. The theme song of all empires is Vader's Imperial March. Ba 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 da. That's tremendous thematic work. It builds visions. And then we've got this second melody. Now remember, this is not a countermelody. This is just a whole other melody. And this is attached to a different person who appears in here. Because where you have a fairy prince or a fairy king, what must you have? A fairy queen or a fairy princess. So nature doesn't work without... Don't care about your gender agendas. This is simply looking at the system. So suddenly this comes in. And if I remember correctly, this is exactly the same as this. So that ties it together. Definitely the bass line, all of this is essentially the same. You can see the notes are in different places and what have you, but it's essentially the same. But we've shifted from his energy, which is rather to... So she comes in and her sound is much brighter. It's still a synth. It still very much says I'm a synth. In this case, it's a little bit like an organ, like a B3 type organ, but it's not. It's very synthy as well. So she's providing a different theme, which is where she's all kind of, but she's counterpointing to him, even though they don't play together initially. So he's come in and he's all very sort of like, and she's come in behind him and sort of basically go, yeah, dude, you're being a bit of a doofus, and provided a different energy. If we left it there, it would become a little bit pointless. But then they have to work together. So we pull the two together. Yep. So they play in counterpoint to each other, but they work together. And even though you don't really hear it, she's continuing his line. So that's merely understanding that once we start to extract melody, they can't and shouldn't sit as these random progression of noises, that they need to come into some kind of thematic style. They can be very obvious, dum 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 dum, or this, which is Not as obvious as that, because I'm not John Williams, unfortunately. But things that I commonly use, like ba, 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 that's developed a very strong theme. Jump! And we key into that theme because it says something. Even if we could never say what it says something, and we follow that theme. So as soon as you start to develop melody, work out what the story is that it's telling. What's its theme? What's it about? You can modify that with particular instruments. So in theory, we should be able to take Van Halen's Jump, Eddie's cool moving chords, and play them off on a flute and make them sound quite different. We've changed the person who's telling the story, but ultimately it should stay roughly the same, even if it doesn't have an Oberheim playing it. That just gives you a view inside a piece. And if you're interested, go have a listen to the whole piece. Again, it's nothing about whether this is great music or whether you dig this style of music, but just to say, hey, this is where I'm going with melody, and this is how I make it work for me. And regardless of genre, this is essentially how it's done. It's essentially how it's done in classical music, and it's exactly the same as essentially how it's done in jazz, in new age, in trap, all of those things. Just be aware, though, that as we get into trap is hideously boiled down, and they have a nasty habit of taking a fraction of a melody, playing it at half the speed, and abandoning the second half, which is part of why it doesn't do as well commercially as it should. And taking how things do commercially now with how they used to, let's take Celine's My Heart Will Go On. Whether you like this lady and the song is irrelevant. It's actually a tremendously well-written song because everything is where it should be. We've got great themes inside that song, which is why it sold lots, and it sent lots of people to the movies so they can go, because it's got great themes and they're well expressed. That's the thing you want to learn how to do, and that takes practice. So please go out there, do your homework, create your set of chords, smooth them off if necessary, and then work out how to extrapolate and make a melody that you can play round and round in, let's say, 4 bars. We're going to look at how to expand that more next week. Any questions? If you're wanting to hire me directly, obviously be in contact. Broader questions, ask down below. Please hit subscribe. Please go across to my Ko-fi to support me in supporting you in getting this done. You have a great day now.